January 12, 1945. A crossroads in the Ardennes. A Wehrmacht officer asks, how? In answer, the night gives up 5,000 tons of ammunition, unloaded, sorted, and on trucks within hours. From factory floors in Ohio to piers in Antwerp to drivers on freezing roads, an industrial system turned paperwork into shells and shells into survival. The Allies didn't just fight with soldiers, they fought with a nation that turned logistics into an unstoppable weapon. Don't skip. The full video shows the supply chain in motion and why that sound of crates hitting pavement was the end of the German gamble.
January 12, 1945. Somewhere along the snowbound road between Bastogne and the German frontier, a Wehrmacht major stood at a crossroads he no longer understood. The air smelled of diesel and wet pine. The sky hung low and colorless, pressing down on the frozen landscape like a lid on a tomb. He had stopped his staff car to study the horizon through field glasses, searching not for enemy positions, but for an answer to a question that gnawed at the edges of his exhausted mind. How? Behind him, the wreckage of the Ardennes offensive lay scattered across 40 miles of Belgian forest. Burnt-out panzers, frozen bodies still clutching weapons, supply trucks abandoned when the fuel ran dry. Ahead, through the mist and the skeletal trees, came a sound he had learned to dread. Not the roar of engines or the crack of artillery, but something deeper and more relentless. The grinding, mechanical hum of abundance. American trucks, hundreds of them, moving in columns so dense they seemed less like a military convoy and more like a steel river flowing westward, each vehicle laden with crates, barrels, ammunition boxes stacked so high they swayed with the motion of the road. He lowered the glasses. His hands were shaking, though not from cold. 6 weeks earlier, German intelligence officers had briefed the assault commanders on American logistics with the kind of condescension reserved for amateurs. The Americans, they said, were rich but soft. They had factories, yes, great sprawling complexes in Detroit and Pittsburgh that churned out tanks and aircraft with assembly line efficiency, but wealth was not war. Logistics was about discipline, about precision, about the kind of organizational rigor that only the German military tradition could produce. The American supply system, by contrast, was a patchwork of improvisation. Too many commands, too many overlapping jurisdictions, too much reliance on civilian contractors who cared more about profit than planning. The briefings included charts and maps, all of them designed to prove a single point: that the Allies' greatest weakness was not courage or firepower, but coordination. Their supply lines stretched across the Atlantic, through the chaos of French ports still scarred by bombardment, along roads clogged with refugees and rear echelon units who didn't know the first thing about traffic discipline. Cut those roads, the planners said, and you cut the arteries of the entire Allied advance. Starve them of ammunition, of fuel, of food, and watch their offensive collapse under its own weight. It had sounded reasonable at the time. More than reasonable, it had sounded inevitable. But standing now at that crossroads in the frozen silence of mid-January, watching the endless procession of American trucks grind past with their cargo of shells and gasoline and rations, the major understood that something fundamental had been misunderstood. Not miscalculated, misunderstood. The Americans had not built a logistics system. They had built a machine, vast and impersonal and unstoppable, driven not by tradition or discipline, but by a kind of industrial momentum that defied every assumption the Wehrmacht had ever made about how wars were won. The German general staff had spent 2 centuries perfecting the science of maneuver warfare. From the campaigns of Frederick the Great to the blitzkrieg that shattered Poland and France, German doctrine had rested on a single principle: concentrate force at the decisive point, strike before the enemy can react, and let speed compensate for numerical inferiority. Logistics, in this tradition, was a secondary concern. A well-trained German division could march 30 miles in a day, could forage from the countryside, could operate on captured enemy supplies when its own lines stretched thin. This was not recklessness, it was calculated risk, the kind that had won empires. The Americans, by contrast, had no such tradition. Their military history was one of continental expansion against irregular opponents, of slow, grinding campaigns supplied from bases that never moved. Even their involvement in the First World War had been brief and limited, more a matter of showing up with fresh troops than demonstrating any mastery of operational art. When the Wehrmacht's intelligence officers studied American doctrine in the years before 1944, what they found confirmed their prejudices. A military culture obsessed with material superiority, with overwhelming the enemy through sheer weight of numbers rather than elegance of design. The Americans planned everything. They scheduled everything. They requisitioned and cataloged and inventoried with a bureaucratic zeal that seemed to belong more to accountants than to soldiers. And so when the Ardennes offensive began on December 16, 1944, German commanders allowed themselves a moment of grim satisfaction. The plan was audacious. 3 entire armies, more than 400,000 men, crashing through the thinly held American lines in Belgium with the goal of splitting the Allied front in two and recapturing the port of Antwerp. If successful, it would sever the supply routes that fed the British and American armies, strand them in place, and force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace. But even if the offensive fell short of its ultimate objective, it would accomplish something almost as valuable. It would demonstrate, once and for all, that the German army still possessed the tactical brilliance and operational daring that no amount of American industrial muscle could overcome. For the first 72 hours, it worked. German tanks smashed through American positions held by green troops who had never seen combat. Entire regiments surrendered or broke and fled. Communication lines collapsed. Command posts were overrun so quickly that maps and codebooks were captured intact. The weather, low clouds and freezing fog, grounded Allied air power, giving the panzers the kind of freedom of movement they hadn't enjoyed since 1940. By December 19, German spearheads had penetrated 40 miles into Allied territory, encircling the crossroads town of Bastogne and leaving a salient in the American lines that resembled a giant bulge on the map, as if the entire front had been punched in the gut. And then the weather cleared. On December 23, the skies over Belgium opened into a cold, crystalline blue. Within hours, American transport aircraft filled the air. C-47s flying in tight formations, their bellies packed with ammunition, medical supplies, and rations. They dropped their cargo over Bastogne in bundles that floated down on white parachutes, drifting like seeds over the frozen fields. The German soldiers, watching from their positions in the surrounding woods, could not believe what they were seeing. This was not resupply. This was theater. A demonstration of power so casual, so effortless, that it bordered on insult. But the real blow came not from the air, but from the roads. Between December 20 and January 10, the United States Army moved more than 250,000 tons of supplies into the Ardennes salient, a figure that represented more material than the entire Wehrmacht had transported during the first 3 months of Operation Barbarossa. The supplies did not trickle in. They did not arrive in carefully rationed convoys spaced over weeks. They arrived in a deluge. On the night of January 3 alone, American transport units delivered 5,000 tons of artillery ammunition to forward depots near the town of Liège, enough shells to sustain a month-long barrage by 3 full corps. The ammunition had been manufactured in factories across the United States, loaded onto ships in New York and Baltimore, sailed across the Atlantic to the port of Antwerp, unloaded by dock workers operating around the clock under floodlights, sorted by supply units working in shifts, loaded onto trucks driven by men from the Red Ball Express and the Quartermaster companies, and delivered to the front in less than 18 hours from the moment the request was filed. 18 hours. German officers who interrogated captured American soldiers during this period often asked the same question: How do you do it? How does your army move so much, so fast, with so little apparent effort? The Americans, most of them clerks or drivers who had never fired a shot in combat, shrugged. They didn't know. They just followed orders, filled out the forms, drove the routes they were told to drive. The system worked because it was designed to work, and it was designed by men who understood that war was not art, it was production. At the heart of that system was a document called the War Department Supply Catalog, a multi-volume reference that listed every item the U.S. Army might need in the field, from tank engines to typewriter ribbons. Each one assigned a unique stock number and specifications for packaging, shipping, and storage. When a battalion commander in Belgium needed artillery shells, he didn't send a desperate plea up the chain of command. He filed a requisition using the correct stock numbers, and the system responded. The requisition was transmitted by radio or teletype to a forward supply depot, which checked its inventory. If the depot had the shells, they were loaded and dispatched. If not, the request was relayed to a base depot farther back, then to a port warehouse, and, if necessary, all the way back to an ammunition plant in Illinois or Pennsylvania. At every stage, the movement was tracked, logged, and coordinated with transportation units, who adjusted their routes and schedules to accommodate the flow. It was not glamorous, it was not heroic, but it was devastating in its efficiency. The Red Ball Express, a truck convoy system established after the Normandy breakout, operated on a loop of dedicated highways cleared of all civilian traffic. Drivers, many of them African-American soldiers assigned to segregated transport companies, worked in shifts that stretched 20 hours at a time, sleeping in their cabs during brief rest stops, navigating roads lit only by blackout lights to avoid German bombers. The trucks themselves were GMC 2.5-ton cargo carriers, built with interchangeable parts so that a broken axle or a blown tire could be replaced in minutes using components scavenged from damaged vehicles. When the Ardennes offensive began, the Red Ball Express shifted its entire operation overnight, rerouting convoys from supply depots in France to the Belgian front without a single day's interruption in service. By early January, American supply dumps in the Ardennes sector contained enough food to feed 500,000 men for 2 months, enough gasoline to fuel 10 armored divisions, and enough ammunition to sustain continuous artillery fire at rates that German gunners could only fire for a few desperate hours before exhausting their reserves. The supplies were not hoarded, they were used. American artillery doctrine during the Battle of the Bulge called for time-on-target bombardments, a technique in which dozens of batteries fired simultaneously so that their shells arrived on the enemy position at the exact same moment, creating a coordinated explosion that obliterated everything within 100 meters. These bombardments consumed thousands of rounds in minutes, and then they were repeated, day after day, because the ammunition never ran out. German soldiers who survived these barrages described them in letters and diaries with a kind of numbed disbelief. One Panzer Grenadier, writing to his family in early January, said that the American artillery reminded him of a factory stamping out metal parts, mechanical, repetitive, utterly indifferent to human suffering. Another, captured near the end of the offensive, told his interrogators that he had stopped believing in German victory the moment he realized the Americans could afford to waste shells on a single suspected sniper position. Waste. That was the word he used. In the German army, every shell was precious. Every gallon of fuel rationed with the care of a miser counting coins. The Americans fired as if the supply was infinite, and the terrifying thing was that it might well have been. But the logistics war was not simply a matter of quantity. It was a question of philosophy, of how a nation understood itself and its relationship to war. The German military tradition was rooted in the concept of the decisive battle, the single, perfect maneuver that would shatter the enemy's will and bring the war to a swift conclusion. Logistics existed to serve that vision, to enable the movement of armies to the critical point where history would be decided. When supplies ran short, commanders were expected to improvise, to make do, to rely on the superior skill and morale of their troops to compensate for material deficiencies. This was not seen as a flaw, but as a virtue. proof that the German soldier was tougher, more adaptable, willing to endure hardship than his pampered enemies. The American approach was the opposite. American doctrine assumed that wars were long, grinding affairs that would be won not by brilliance, but by endurance, by the capacity to outlast the enemy in a contest of industrial and organizational stamina. The U.S. Army's logistics system was designed not for the decisive battle, but for the indefinite campaign, for a war that might last years and span continents. Every division, every corps, every army group was supported by a pyramid of supply units that stretched back to bases in England, to ports in North Africa, to depots in the United States itself. The system was redundant by design, built with overlapping layers of reserve stocks so that no single disruption could cripple the flow. When German bombers destroyed a fuel depot near the Belgian border in late December, American engineers had the facility rebuilt and operational within 48 hours, using prefabricated materials stockpiled for exactly that purpose. When a bridge over the Meuse River was blown up by retreating German forces, American combat engineers erected a replacement in less than a day, using a modular Bailey Bridge design that could be assembled by untrained troops following illustrated instructions. This was the thing the German commanders could not grasp. The Americans had systematized improvisation. They had turned adaptability itself into a production line. And behind that production line was a country that had never known war on its own soil, a country whose factories ran at full capacity while its cities slept in peace, whose farmers harvested record crops without fear of bombardment, whose workers assembled tanks and aircraft in sprawling plants lit by electricity that never flickered or failed. The United States in 1945 was producing more war material in a single year than the Axis powers had managed in the entire conflict. It was building a new aircraft carrier every month, launching a new Liberty ship every day, turning out artillery shells by the tens of millions. The scale was not just impressive, it was incomprehensible, so far beyond the experience of European nations that it seemed less like industry and more like a force of nature. And so when the Wehrmacht's intelligence officers mocked American logistics, when they dismissed the U.S. Army as a mob of amateurs drowning in their own surplus, they were making a category error. They were judging the Americans by German standards, by a tradition of military excellence that prized economy and elegance. But the Americans were not trying to be elegant, they were trying to be inevitable. By January 15th, the German offensive had collapsed. The panzers that had driven so deep into Allied lines were now stranded without fuel, their crews abandoning the vehicles and retreating on foot through the snow. German infantry divisions that had begun the offensive at full strength were reduced to combat groups of a few hundred men, scattered and leaderless, hiding in farmhouses and barns to escape the American fighter bombers that prowled the skies from dawn to dusk. The roads that had carried the Wehrmacht's assault were now clogged with wreckage, burned-out trucks, overturned artillery pieces, the frozen bodies of soldiers who had died trying to walk back to Germany. The American counteroffensive, when it came, was not a lightning strike. It was a methodical advance, supported at every step by a logistics network that functioned with the same relentless precision it had maintained throughout the battle. American infantry divisions moved forward behind rolling barrages that cleared the roads of German resistance. Tank battalions refueled at forward dumps where fuel trucks were already waiting, engines idling, hoses ready. Field hospitals set up in captured towns treated wounded soldiers with supplies of plasma, morphine, and antibiotics the German doctors could only dream of. The wounded were evacuated by ambulance to airfields where C-47s flew them to hospitals in France and England, while the same aircraft returned to the front carrying fresh troops and more ammunition. The German soldiers who surrendered during this period were often shocked by what they found in American captivity. They were given hot meals, real meals, with meat and bread and coffee. Within hours of their capture, they were issued blankets, They received medical treatment that was, in many cases, better than what German soldiers received in their own field hospitals. One captured officer, interviewed by American intelligence, remarked that he had never seen an army that fed its prisoners better than its enemies fed their own troops. The comment was meant as an observation, but it functioned as an indictment, a recognition that the war had long since ceased to be a contest of wills and had become a simple equation of resources. By the end of January, the salient created by the Ardennes offensive had been erased. The Allies were back on the positions they had held before December 16, and the Wehrmacht had lost more than 100,000 men, along with 600 tanks and assault guns that could not be replaced. The offensive had cost Germany its last reserves, the final concentration of strength that might have been used to defend the Rhine or delay the Soviet advance in the east. It had achieved nothing except to prove that the German army was still capable of dying with style. But for the men who survived it, the offensive left a different kind of mark. It shattered the illusion that skill and courage could compensate for industrial inferiority. German soldiers who had entered the battle with a kind of desperate hope, the hope that one more push, one more gamble might turn the tide, emerged with the knowledge that they were fighting a war that had already been decided by forces beyond their control. They had not been defeated by better tactics or braver enemies. They had been defeated by a system, by a logistics network so vast and efficient that it rendered individual valor meaningless. There was a sound that haunted the German soldiers who fought in the Ardennes, a sound they would remember long after the war ended. It was not the scream of incoming shells or the roar of tanks. It was quieter than that, almost mundane. The clatter of crates being unloaded from trucks, the metallic clunk of ammunition being stacked, the hiss of fuel being pumped into drums. These were the sounds of American abundance, and they played day and night without interruption, a constant background rhythm that signified something more than logistical efficiency. They signified permanence. The Germans could destroy a supply dump, could strafe a convoy, could blow a bridge, and within hours the Americans would have replaced it, as if the destruction had never happened. There was no winning against an enemy like that. There was only endurance, and eventually, surrender. The crates themselves became a kind of symbol. American supply crates were made of cheap pine, stamped with stenciled letters that identified their contents in a code the Germans quickly learned to decipher. Some contained rations, canned meat, powdered eggs, chocolate bars that German soldiers bartered with civilians or saved as a kind of currency. Others held rifle ammunition, packaged in cardboard boxes nested inside wooden frames that could be broken apart and burned for firewood. Still others carried medical supplies, spare parts, even cigarettes. The Germans, when they captured these crates, were often struck by the carelessness of their construction. The wood was rough, unfinished. The nails bent easily. The whole thing looked thrown together, as if the Americans couldn't be bothered to build something that would last. But that was the point. The crates were disposable because the Americans could afford to treat them as disposable. They were not meant to be reused or conserved. They were meant to be opened, emptied, and discarded, their contents consumed in the vast grinding machine of the Allied advance. And behind every crate, every truck, every barrel of fuel, was a worker in a factory in Ohio or Texas or California, someone who would never see the front lines, but whose labor fed the war machine with the same steady rhythm that the crates were unloaded. This was the secret of American logistics. It was not just a military system, but a civilian one, a seamless integration of the entire national economy into the war effort. When a soldier in Belgium requisitioned a pair of boots, he was drawing on the output of shoe factories that had been converted from producing civilian footwear to military gear. When he called for artillery support, he was spending shells that had been assembled by women working the night shift in munitions plants. The whole country had been mobilized, not through coercion or ideology, but through a kind of voluntary industrialism that treated war production as just another manufacturing problem to be solved. German prisoners who were transported back to the United States for internment often described the experience with a sense of vertigo. They traveled across an ocean patrolled by Allied warships, landed in ports where cranes unloaded cargo faster than they had thought possible, and were moved by train through landscapes untouched by war. The cities they passed glowed with electric light. The farms were harvested by machines. The factories ran 3 shifts a day, their smokestacks pouring into the sky. This was the country they had been fighting, and seeing it for the first time, many of them understood that the war had never been winnable. Not because the Americans were better soldiers. In individual battles, German units often outfought their American counterparts, but because the Americans had turned their entire nation into a weapon, and there was no tactic, no strategy, no amount of bravery that could overcome that. The end, when it came, was not dramatic. There was no single moment when the German commanders realized they had lost the logistics war, no meeting where they admitted defeat. It was a slow, cumulative recognition, a gradual collapse of confidence that mirrored the physical collapse of their supply system. By February, German divisions in the West were operating on fuel rations measured in liters per vehicle rather than gallons per day. Artillery batteries fired only when absolutely necessary, conserving shells for the final defensive battles that everyone knew were coming. Soldiers went hungry, not because the food didn't exist, but because there was no way to transport it from depots in Germany to the front lines. The end, when it came, was not dramatic. There was no single moment when the German commanders realized they had lost the logistics war, no meeting where they admitted defeat. It was a slow, cumulative recognition, a gradual collapse of confidence that mirrored the physical collapse of their supply system. By February, German divisions in the West were operating on fuel rations measured in liters per vehicle rather than gallons per day. Artillery batteries fired only when absolutely necessary, conserving shells for the final defensive battles that everyone knew were coming. Soldiers went hungry not because the food didn't exist, but because there was no way to transport it from depots in Germany to the front lines. No trucks, no fuel, no functioning rail network. The American advance into Germany in the spring of 1945 was less a military campaign than a procession. Towns surrendered without a fight when the first American trucks appeared, because the presence of those trucks meant the battle was already over. German commanders, when they met with their American counterparts to negotiate terms, often commented on the disparity. They arrived in staff cars running on the last dregs of fuel, wearing uniforms that had not been cleaned in weeks. The Americans arrived in jeeps that seemed freshly painted, their uniforms crisp, their officers carrying briefcases stocked with maps and documents printed on clean white paper. Even the surrender was an exercise in American abundance. The Germans signed on mimeographed forms produced by the thousands, using pens that the Americans handed out like trinkets. And yet, for all its overwhelming material superiority, the American logistics system was not without its costs. The men who drove the trucks, who loaded the ships, who operated the supply depots, worked in conditions that were often as harsh as combat. The Red Ball Express drivers suffered casualty rates from accidents that rivaled frontline infantry units. Dock workers in Antwerp were killed by German V-2 rockets that fell without warning on the port facilities. Quartermaster units slept in unheated warehouses, working through the winter cold to keep the supplies moving. These men received no medals, no public recognition, no place in the history books. They were the invisible infrastructure of victory, and their sacrifice was measured not in blood, but in exhaustion, in the slow erosion of health and morale that came from doing the same grueling work day after day without respite. But the system did not care about individuals. That was its strength and its cruelty. When a driver collapsed from fatigue, another took his place. When a supply depot was destroyed by bombing, another was built. The machine did not stop, could not stop, because it had been designed to operate beyond the limits of human endurance. It was a system built for total war.
And it would continue functioning until the war ended or the fuel ran out. In the years after the war, military historians would analyze the Battle of the Bulge through the lens of tactics and strategy, debating the decisions made by generals and the courage displayed by soldiers. But the real story of the Ardennes was not about courage or tactics. It was about capacity. It was about the ability of a democratic society to organize itself for total war without descending into tyranny, to mobilize its industries without enslaving its workers, to project power across oceans and continents without collapsing under its own weight. The German commanders who mocked American logistics had failed to understand what they were up against.
They had assumed that military excellence was a function of tradition, of discipline, of the kind of martial spirit that could be cultivated only through centuries of warfare. But the Americans had proven something different, that military power in the industrial age was a function of systems, of organization, of the unglamorous work of building and maintaining the infrastructure that allowed armies to fight. The 5,000 tons of ammunition that arrived in France overnight in January 1945 were not a miracle. They were the product of a logistics network that stretched back across the Atlantic, across the plains of the Midwest, into the mines and factories and rail yards of a nation that had committed itself fully to the war effort. That commitment was not born of ideology or hatred, but of something simpler and more enduring. The conviction that democracy was worth defending, that freedom was worth the cost, and that the work of preservation, the hard, unglamorous labor of feeding and supplying and sustaining, was as vital as the work of fighting. The Wehrmacht had been defeated by many things, by the Soviet Union's vast manpower, by Britain's refusal to surrender, by tactical errors and strategic miscalculations. But in the West, in the frozen forests of Belgium, it had been defeated by something more prosaic and more profound, by clerks and drivers and dock boys. Workers, by supply officers and quartermasters and the men who built the crates and loaded the trucks. It had been defeated by the patient, grinding power of a nation that understood that wars are not won by decisive battles, but by the capacity to endure, to outlast, to continue fighting long after the enemy's will and resources have been exhausted. And if there was a lesson in that, it was not one of glory or heroism, but of humility. The crates that littered the roads of Belgium in the winter of 1945, empty and discarded, were monuments to a different kind of strength. The strength of a system that could afford to waste, that could treat even its abundance as disposable because there was always more coming. They were a reminder that in the end, wars are not decided by the courage of soldiers or the brilliance of generals, but by the quiet, unglamorous work of the people who keep the machine running. The people who load the trucks and sail the ships and work the night shift in the factories. The people who never asked for recognition, who never expected glory, but who understood that their labor was the foundation on which victory was built. The Wehrmacht had mocked that system, and the system had buried them beneath 5,000 tons of proof.